is. An elevating friendship includes all the components of the pleasant friendship, but surpasses it because both aspire to some exalted goal, moral improvement. It is extremely difficult for a person to perfect his character and his behavior without a good friend who supports good deeds, but also provides constructive criticism. Such a friendship provides a safety net for both parties and imparts emotional and spiritual security. This type of friendship provides a high-level bond between people and is difficult to obtain. And just to start the next section, Eov and his friends, well, Eov is actually, in English you say Job, who experienced a lot of hardship and had a very difficult life, but still, I think, had emunah and was still in the game. So the book of Eov provides a description of a profound bond of friendship of the kind praised by the Rambam. Having heard of all his troubles and sufferings, Eov's friends came to console and commiserate with him. Eov's three friends heard about the catastrophe that came upon him, and each came from his own place. Eliphaz the Taimani, Bildad the Shuchite, and Zephar the Naamiti. For they gathered together to mourn with him and comfort him. And let's just finish with this one. The Yalkut Shimoni comments in Eov, page 893, explains how these men who lived so far from one another and lacked any means of communicating with each other all heard of Eov's calamity and assembled at the same time to visit their suffering friend. Okay, we'll continue next time. I don't want to take too much more time. We'll continue next time.
All right. I was going to just ask you guys on one separate note, in terms of the fast tomorrow. What time is it in?
I sent you the fast, Damon?
Yeah.
Sent you the time. So.
Oh, sorry, guys. My blood sugar was low.
On the group,
Did you guys see it?
So it starts in Joburg at 5:15 and ends at 5:52 p.m. 5:41 a.m. start, ends 5:42 p.m.
5:42 p.m. Okay. And Gavin, are you allowed to fast your stuff or not really?
I'm allowed to, but I don't think I'm going to. I'm not at that stage yet.
Okay, so do you do something or not, or how does it work with how you feel?
I'll see. Tomorrow. I'll play it by ear.
Okay, you'll play it by ear. Okay, that's fair enough. Nothing wrong with that. Okay, guys, let's just get started. Now I'm just going to share the mission on the screen for 1 second. All right, Kev, just read it.
Okay.
The Mishnah lists further cases in which a thief is exempt from the fourfold or fivefold payment. If the thief sold the stolen animal with the exception of 1/100th of it, or he originally had a partnership in it, and after selling it from his partner he slaughtered or sold it, or one slaughters it and it becomes an availer through his hand, or one slits it open lengthwise or tears out its pipes instead of slaughtering it properly, he pays the twofold payment of an ordinary thief, but does not pay the fourfold or fivefold payment of one who sells or slaughters the stolen animal.
Okay, good. All right, so guys, I'll tell you what I'm going to share with you. I'm going to explain to you, I'm going to go backwards in the Gemara. I'm going to actually tell you the opinions of the various rabbis, and then from then work backwards in the Gemara, because it might add a bit of clarity after Thursday's night's issue. So this is the following, is that obviously there's only liability if you steal the entirety of the animal, because it says if you slaughter it or if you sell it, meaning that it means its entirety, not part thereof. Okay, so what we have is we have a variety of opinions. The first one is Rav's view, that the exclusion of something that becomes permitted through shchita, in other words, any amount of flesh from any part of the animal exempts the thief, because that's something that you would consume after shchita. Do you understand Rav's view is, guys. In other words, it uses the term if he slaughters it or sells it. What does slaughter mean is we've often learned that there's a comparative, that the same rules apply to slaughter as apply to the sale. You remember that because it's juxtaposed in the verse. So in other words, whether you sell it or slaughter it, what does the word slaughter have to do with it? So according to Rav, it means that anything that you could consume after the animal is slaughtered, that's kosher, any kosher section of the animal would consist of the animal itself. In other words, if you left out a steak out of the animal, or you left out anything that you could consume, that's not the entirety of the animal. So obviously Rav doesn't then include things that are extraneous for consumption. In other words, shearings, horns, anything that's not eaten by the shchita process is considered not part of the animal's inclusionary term. Okay. Then you've got a slightly different opinion. You've got the Bava Kamma, which is the general rabbinical opinion, that says any exclusion to the sale exempts the thief, meaning any part of the animal that's left out exempts the thief from the 4 or 5-fold payment, even if it's something that you wouldn't consume, like the horn. And it goes even further and says even the shearings. Then you've got, according to Rebbe, he goes very much according to Rav, but he's more stringent. He says there's only an exclusion of a vital organ that exempts the thief. So what he's saying is anything that you leave out that would render shchita not permitted because it's a nevela, that is something that would make the thief ineligible to pay the 4 or 5-fold if he sold it. Okay? But he doesn't assume, as does Rav, that if something's left out like the fillet steak, that is deemed as essential. He's saying something essential that's left out is something that would render the animal unfit for slaughter. So he's saying that particular case, that would make an exclusion for the 4 or 5-fold payment. Okay, now, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, the exclusion of even a horn, which is inedible, exempts him, and only the exclusion of the shearings fail to exempt him. So according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, a horn is very much part of the animal, but the shearings are not part of the animal. That's something that an animal will feel no pain and survive if he does without his woolly coat. In other words, it's considered extraneous to the animal. So if you took the shearings off the animal, it would still make him liable to payment, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. But if you took off the horn, which is inedible, even according to Rebbe and Rav, it would still exempt him from the 4 or 5-fold payment. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's start off the Gemara, but at least now you've got all the opinions. That's why we're working backwards. Okay, I hope it was a bit more helpful the way it was done. So the Gemara seeks clarification on the Mishnah's first ruling. What is the meaning of with the exception of 1/100th of it? That is, what part of the animal, when withheld from the sale, constitutes a meaningful exclusion that causes the thief to be exempt from the 4 or 5-fold payment because he failed to sell the entire animal. So there's two opinions that are cited. Rav says that the Mishnah means that the thief is exempt if he sold it without the exception of something that becomes permitted with it through shchita. In other words, the thief must withhold a small portion of the animal's flesh from the sale in order to be exempt from the penalty. If he withholds only its hide, for example, or its horns or its wool, things that are not edible, he has not made a valid exclusion and is liable to the 4-fold or 5-fold payment. That's Rashi's explanation of Rav. So then you've got Levi, who's got a different opinion. He said the Mishnah means to exempt him even if he sold it with the exception of its shearings. In other words, basically the wool that stands to be shorn from it. So Levi is probably the most the most lenient opinion, because he's basically saying that even the exclusion of an extraneous part of the animal is meaningful in regard to exemption from the fourfold or fivefold payment. Because Rashi explains that according to Levi, if anything is left out, it's not the animal in its entirety. So he's the most lenient opinion. Then you've got the opinion, well, firstly, we're going to see that there's a brisa that says if it was sold with the exception of its shearings, he's exempt from the fourfold or fivefold payment. Now, do you recognize that opinion? It was the last opinion that we basically read of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Okay? So, in other words, if it was taught in the brisa, if it was sold with the exception of its shearings, he is exempt from the four or fivefold payment. It means everything but the shearings obligates him in this particular case. So we're going to have to find out whose opinion that is, because the Rav's opinion is challenged from a completely different Mishnah. It's based on this brisa, which says, if the thief sold the stolen animal with the exceptions of its foreleg, or with the exception of its hind leg, with the exception of its horn, with the exception of its shearings, he does not pay the four or fivefold payment. So according to Rav would agree that if the foreleg or hind leg is left off, because I did read notes and commentaries, and they said that the hind leg in that case was eligible for consumption because the sciatic nerve was taken out. So the foreleg or hind leg, if it was left out, from basically, we're going to see from where it is above the knee, etc., is that's not deemed that's not deemed to be a contradiction to Rav, because Rav is saying, look, that's part of the animal that you would consume for shchita. So therefore, that's not the entire animal that the thief is selling, and therefore he doesn't owe the four or fivefold payment. So he agrees with the Mishnah so far. The part that's a challenge to Rav is the second part, where it says with the exception of its horn, or with the exceptions of its shearings, because Rav is saying that that is not consumable as part of shchita, because you wouldn't consume the horn or its shearings, so therefore that's not seen as a significant hold-off, and therefore it'd say you were obligated for the four or fivefold payment. So this is a challenge to Rav, especially about the horns and the shearing. So Rebbe has a different opinion. And Rebbe said if he sold it with the exception of something that is essential for shchita, he does not pay the four or fivefold payment. So he's even more stringent than Rav, because he's saying, Rebbe is saying the thief is excluded from liability for the sale of an organ if it's missing would invalidate the slaughter. Okay? Which is what Kevin touched on the other day. So any organ whose removal would halachically render the animal nevela, even while it's still alive. That includes the esophagus or the trachea, because if that's removed, well, then the question Kevin asked the other day is, could that be a treifa? So, Kevin, it is a very interesting question, is that if it does become a treifa, because the animal is set to die because that organ is missing, then you can't eat it anyway. And if it's in the veil, in other words, it's not considered a proper shchita, because the animal, it had a problem with the trachea or the esophagus, and you wouldn't technically be able to do a traditional shchita, and the animal could live with that defect. It's still under the category of nevela. Either way, Kevin's right, you can't have it. So that obviously includes the esophagus or the trachea, the thigh and its cavity, the liver, or one of the intestines. That's according to the 21st daf of Chulin and the commentary on Rashi, which means, I don't know what it means by its cavity. I'm assuming the cavity in the chest means there's a problem in the lung area. As far as the thigh is concerned, there's a problem, because that would, Kevin, that's a classic case of that would not be a treifa. An animal can live without its thigh, but it's not considered an animal that's necessarily fit for shchita. It's considered defectual from that point of view, but not in terms of that it's going to die as a matter of course. It's not a terminally ill animal. So that would be more of the category of nevela. But some of the categories we mentioned is as answering your question that the animal might not live long enough, apart from rendering it unfit for consumption from a nevela point of view. So it was a good point you brought up the other day, Kevin. I looked into it. Thank you. So Rebbe is much more stringent than Rav. He's saying that if it's missing a vital organ at which you can't slaughter the animal, and you withhold that from the sale, the thief then isn't eligible to the 4 or 5-fold payment. Whereas Rav says you hold back any of its flesh, which would be consumed after shchita, and it invalidates the liability for 4 or 5-fold. Okay? Levi said completely the opposite, that even if you sold the animal with its without its horn, etc., it's going to remove obligation from the thief. So Levi is saying anything you leave off the animal, there's no 4 or 5-fold payment, with the exception of its shearings, Gavin, because shearings is an external coat of the animal. It's not considered a vital part of the animal because, and the proof of it is, if you shave the animal off, it's still a valid animal. It's still its entirety. It's just like a Rastafarian with long hair or a guy from the army with a crew cut, according to that opinion. Okay. Then you've got the Bava Kamma, who basically says anything that you withhold would render it not in its entirety, and therefore there is an exemption for the 4 or 5-fold payment. Okay. So we want to know that how. Basically, we want to know. There's a question that comes up, and that question is: if the thief sold it with the exception of something that it's not essential for shchita, in other words, according to Rebbe, he excluded a foreleg or hind leg below the knee. So that doesn't render the animal treifa, because an animal's life is not in danger. So it's exactly Kevin's question. Kevin, you need to go to Chulin 76a, and that'll answer your question about what's considered treifa and nevela in terms of life defect. But either way, this point remains the same, is if it renders the animal unfit for slaughter by removing that animal, and you chop off that vital part and sell the rest of the animal, there's no liability for 4 or 5-fold. Okay. So the question basically goes, but if he sold it with the exception of something that is not essential for shchita, he does not pay the 4 or 5-fold payment. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says if he sold it with the exception of its horn, he does not pay the 4 or 5-fold payment. But if he sold it with the exception of his shearings, he does pay the 4 or 5-fold payment. So Rav Shimon ben Elazar is like Levi in that respect with regards to the shearing, but not with regard to the horn. Because Levi says if you sell the animal and you hold back the horn, there's no eligibility as far as that's concerned. The Gemara basically has a challenge now, because all is well according to Levi, for the interpretation of the Mishnah accords with the Bava Kamma of the Brisa, but according to Rav, there is a difficulty. Whom does his interpretation accord? In other words, none of the Tanaim except Rav's view that the exclusion of something that becomes permitted through shchita, in other words, any amount of flesh from part of the animal, that exempts the thief. Okay. So the Gemara explains the reasoning behind the Tanaic opinion cited. And basically the Gemara says that Rav states his ruling in accordance with this Tana, what was taught in a Brisa. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says if he sold the animal with the exception of its foreleg, with the exception of its hind leg, he does not pay the 4 or 5-fold payment. If he sold it with the exception of its horns or with the exception of its shearings, he does pay the 4 or 5-fold payment. So we can see that the exclusion of a portion of the animal containing flesh, which becomes permitted through slaughter, that exempts the thief. Okay, in other words, it's obvious that the thief doesn't incur the 4 or 5-fold penalty for the act of slaughtering, unless the animal was fit to be slaughtered, but not if it was missing an organ that made its slaughter meaningless from a halachic perspective. Okay, so we're going to see why Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar has got two different opinions. Because if we read the previous brisa, it says if he sold it with the exception of his horns, he does not pay the 4 or 5-fold payment, but if he sold it with the exception of its shearings, he does pay the 4 or 5-fold payment. Then we learned a separate brisa, which says something a little bit different, is that if he sold the animal with the exception of its foreleg or with the exception of its hind leg, he does not pay the 4 or 5-fold payment. If he sold it with the exception of its horns or with the exception of its shearings, he pays the 4 or 5-fold payment. So what it was saying before is that with regards to the horn, there wasn't a 4 or 5-fold payment, but here there is. And it's the same rabbi that said the same thing. So we've got to look at the context of what that means. So if you look behind the reasoning of each Tanaic opinion, we want to see in what issue they disagree. So the Bava Kamma holds that we require the fulfillment of the verse and he slaughters it, which implies the entirety of it, and we are required to fulfill the commandment of the verse, or he sells it, which also implies the entirety of it, in order for the thief to be liable to the 4-fold or 5-fold payment. So, guys, you can see, according to this opinion, there's a juxtaposition between the word slaughter and selling, that if it mentions in the verse he slaughters it, and you can't perform a proper shchita because something's missing, it's the same thing when you sell it, that if it's missing that, you can't perform a proper sale, which is a 4 or 5-fold liability. But Rebbe holds, however, as it says, that the verse, and he slaughters it, obviously refers to an animal that is halachically subject to slaughter, to the exclusion of an animal that is not halachically subject to slaughter. Okay? So since the Torah states, and he slaughtered it when he sells it, it implies that his liability when he sells it is comparable to his liability when slaughtering it, just as the thief is not liable to the penalty for slaughtering if the animal is missing an essential part of its body, like treifa, as Kevin said, or nevela. He's not liable to the penalty for selling if he excludes an essential part of the animal's body from the sale. However, he is liable to the penalty if he merely excludes a part of the body that is not essential. So what would that be? Well, we went through the different opinions, and Rav Shimon ben Elazar agrees with the Bava Kamma that excludes a non-essential part of the body suffices, but he holds that with respect to a horn, which does not stand to be cut off, its exclusion from the sale constitutes an exclusion of the part of the animal itself, and therefore, if the thief exempts it, he does not pay the 4 or 5-fold payment. So what it's saying is, as far as the shearings are concerned, that's not something that would physically render the animal, defectual, because the shearings will grow back. But if you remove a horn, that does affect the animal in terms of its look or value, etc. So therefore, that is an essential part to exclude from the horn. But that doesn't concur with who? With Rebbe and Rav. Okay? But it does concur with the Bava Kamma. But the Bava Kamma is even more strict with regards to the shearings. Okay, but as for the animal shearings, which stands to be cut off, the exclusion from the sale does not constitute an exclusion of part of the animal itself, and therefore, even if a thief excludes them, he pays the 4 or 5-fold payment. And the other Tana of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar's currently. So, guys, you've got basically two opinions. There's one part of the Tana of Rabbi Shimon's academy that said that obviously there is basic. How do I put this? I want to put it in a simple way. Okay, so the one explanation or a faction of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar's academy, he quotes the opinion in the second brisa that holds, with respect to the animal's foreleg or hind leg, which requires slaughter, in order for their flesh to be permissible, the exclusion from the sale constitutes a meaningful exclusion. And therefore, if the thief excludes one of them, he doesn't pay the 4 or 5-fold payment. But as for its horns and shearings, which do not require slaughter, since they are not fit for consumption, the exclusion from the sale doesn't constitute a meaningful exclusion. Therefore, even if the thief excludes them, he is liable to the 4 or 5-fold payment. So obviously now the Gemara is going to focus on the variant rulings of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar in the two brisos, which we read. So it says these views of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar are contradictory. So the Gemara answers the two brisos are attributed to two Tanoim, presenting different versions of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar's opinion. So the rabbis taught in a brisa, one who steals an amputated animal, a lame or a blind animal, and then slaughters or sells it, and so too one who steals an animal of partners and slaughters or sells it, he is liable to the 4 or 5-fold payment. So what we are saying is that according to that one opinion, is deemed to have sold the entirety of the animal, even when it's missing a limb, because he sold everything that he stole. So if you steal an animal and it's missing a limb and you sell it, you sold it in the state that it was in its entirety. And therefore there's liability as far as that's concerned, even if you remove one of the organs. Kevin, are you okay?
Yeah, I'm fine.
So you're saying if he had it, he had the animal in where it was already missing foreleg or a hind leg, and he sold it, it's actually a fourfold of, it's actually, he sold it at 100% of what it was.
Exactly.
Is that what
that's exactly what it's saying. So one of the opinions is, listen, if you buy a lame animal, a blind one, and then you slaughter or sell it, you've sold the animal in its entirety in the state that you picked it up at. However, if you hacked off a leg and then sold it in that particular case, there's no eligibility because you haven't sold the entire animal and it's your fault as the thief because you actually separated that part. So it bothers me a little bit, this, for a couple of reasons. The first one is we're not meant to create cruelty to animals. So when you've got a law which says, well, there's no eligibility for a 4 or 5-fold payment, you figure if you're going to get caught, you don't want to pay that payment. So what stops you from hacking off the animal's leg? Because there is a Noahide law that you can't tear the flesh off a living animal. So the problem is, I think it's going to get one to end up being cruel to that animal for financial reasons. So you could say that maybe it's not the case where the person, if they know about the Noahide law, they're not going to do it, but they know that theft is prevented also by the Noahide law. So if somebody clearly steals and they're not worried about the Noahide law of theft, what makes you think they're going to worry about the Noahide law about tearing flesh from a living animal? They've already broken one Noahide law. That's my issue.
And there's another loophole as well, is just on a regular animal, if they steal it and it's got a horn, you just remove the horn on the lenient opinion.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, that's a much better opinion because the horn is something that wouldn't hurt the animal to remove. Exactly that. So you're not breaking a Noahide law, and all of a sudden you don't pay the 4 or 5-fold payment. And that's why we can understand Rav and Rebbe, because Rav would say that has nothing to do with an exemption of a significant part of the animal, because you're not going to consume it. And Rebbe said it's not even a vital organ that would prevent you doing shchita. So he's even more stringent in terms of the exemption. So that's it. But the more lenient opinion does make sense from the one perspective, as Gavin said, is that you wouldn't create cruelty to the animal if you just removed its shearings. But that's even more of a lenient opinion. But even the more stringent one, where you could remove a horn and you don't have liability, that's the first thing you'd cut off. Gavin's 100% correct. So now we want to know about partners. What happens with partners? Okay. So it says, and so too one who steals an animal of partners and slaughters or sells it is liable to the 4 or 5-fold payment. But partners who stole an animal and then slaughtered or sold it are exempt from the 4 or 5-fold payment. So we're going to see what this means. But the Gemara also was taught in another brisa, partners who stole an animal and then slaughtered or sold it are liable to the full fivefold payment. So we've got a bit of a contradiction as far as that's concerned. So the Gemara answers, Rav Nachman said there's no difficulty. Here in the brisa that exempts partners, we are dealing with a partner who stole from his fellow partner. And what does that actually mean, guys, is that in that case, he stole only half the animal. That's why he's exempt from the 4 or 5-fold payment, even for the half that he did steal, because the Torah imposes the fine only in one who slaughters or sells the entirety of the animal lawlessly. So do you remember when we learned about a father a son that inherits an animal from his father, and then he stole the section and sold it? He doesn't owe the brothers the 4 or 5-fold penalty because he didn't get it in lawlessness. Part of the animal was his originally. All he has to do is make restitution to his brothers on what he stole. But he doesn't have to pay a 4 or 5-fold payment because he had a share of the animal. So what we're saying here is if one of the business partners stole from his partner, he had a share of his share, which means it wasn't in lawlessness and it wasn't in entirety because he only sold half of it that he wasn't entitled to, and that's his partner's share. So therefore, he just has to make restitution to his partner, but he doesn't need to pay the 4 or 5-fold. So what we learned before is if you steal from your business partner, you have to pay a 2-fold payment, but if you're stealing from brothers, there's no penalty. You just pay the principal. You remember that?
It would seem, I do remember that, and you're correct, but it would seem that if your partner steals, that you should actually pay double the 4 or 5-fold payment because your guard is down with your partner. You trust your partner, whereby a thief that comes in from the outside, this is just my opinion, and a partner comes in from, not a partner, a thief comes in from the outside, you're not expecting him to come. I mean, if you see a guy hanging around there that's not your partner, you don't trust the guy. Whereby your partner you trust. That's what I'm saying.
So Gavin's right in that this is the same thing that you're dealing with a guardian, a shomer, is that you trust the guardian, and it says you gave it to him lawfully, and then he decided to keep it as collateral and sell it. So it's the same sort of thing. So there is, as Gavin said, that's exactly why we make a business partner pay double, and he shall pay double. But brothers, we don't create that machlokas, so you only pay the principal back. So Gavin, you pay double, but you don't pay 4 or 5-fold because you've got a share in the animal. Therefore, it's not entirely in lawlessness because in order to be eligible for the 4 or 5-fold, you have to steal it in its entirety. And you're not. You've got half the animal, of a share of it. So it's not in its entirety, so you're not fulfilling that prescribed verse. And it's not in lawlessness because you've got part of a share in the animal. So you have to pay back double to your business partner, which is enough to deter you, believe me. But to brothers, you only pay back the principal. So it's concurring with you, not arguing with you.
Yeah. No, 100%. No, but I heard the facts. I knew I was wrong. I just wanted to say, I was just giving you my opinion.
It's actually not arguing with your opinion. It's seeing merit in it. That's why you pay double.
Yeah, I suppose so. Thank you.
Sure. So it was a good point. So Rav Nachman said, here in the brisa that exempts partners, we are dealing with a partner who stole from his fellow partner, whereas here in the brisa that holds partners liable, we are dealing with a partner who stole from elsewhere together with its fellow. So what we are saying is you had 2 thieves and robbers that were business partners, and they stole from an innocent person. And in that particular case, one of them actually removed it from the owner's possession and then slaughtered or sold it. But he did so on his own and his fellow's behalf, having been appointed as that fellow's agent. So in that case, the entire animal was slaughtered and sold unlawfully, and the penalty is therefore included. Okay? But Rav Nachman's explanation is refuted, and I'll just tell you why, and we'll end off on this note. We've got 3.5 minutes. Rava challenged Rav Nachman on the basis of the following brisa. It might be thought that a partner who stole an animal from his fellow partner, or partners who stole an animal together are liable to the 4 or 5-fold payment if they slaughter or sell it. The Torah therefore states, and he slaughters it, which implies that we require that he slaughter the entirety of it lawlessly in order for him to become liable to the penalty. And this is lacking here. So we see that even partners who steal from elsewhere are not subject to the 4 or 5-fold payment. So what it's saying is, basically,
So always team up with somebody. That's
yeah,
it.
but the problem is if they team up, they're still not selling the animal in its entirety because they don't have a shareholding of the entirety. In other words,
That's why they win.
well, that's in a way why they win, because one half was slaughtered personally by the one who stole it, and the other half by the agent of the one who stole it. So we learned on the 71st daf that a thief who commissions an agent to slaughter or sell the stolen animal is liable to the 4-fold or 5-fold payment, because the entirety was slaughtered lawlessly in a manner which liability incurred. But there's a different case here, because generally we've got a case of there's no agency to commit an act of transgression. But that's different here, because it says in this verse the word instead. 5 cattle you shall pay instead of the ox. So listen, we're going to go through what that means of why the 2 thieves are not liable. But in principle, it means that they don't keep it the share in entirety if they've got a partner in crime. That's the problem. So they can only sell their share to another party, because the partner can only share his other share. So when you've got 2 thieves, there's no liability, exactly as Gavin said. That is an issue. All right, guys, we'll end off on this note. I hope it makes sense. Do you understand the opinion of Rebbe, of Rav, of the Tana Kamma? Guys, you all...
Yeah, but maybe not by name. Rava, definitely. And yeah,
right. So
Rava.
I'm going to end off with a minute just to give a summary. Rav basically has the view that exclusion of something that becomes permitted through shchita, in other words, any amount of flesh from the animal, if a thief holds that back and sells the animal, it exempts him from the 4 or 5-fold payment. According to the general rabbinic opinion, the Tana Kamma, any exclusion to the sale exempts the thief. According to Rebbe, only the exclusion of a vital organ exempts the thief, because you can't do shchita on the animal's nevela. And according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, the exclusion of even a horn, which is inedible, exempts him from liability. Only the shearings doesn't count and fails to exempt him, because it's not part of the animal. That's it in a nutshell, guys. I hope it's been helpful.
Yeah, very good. Scott, thank you.
All right. Sorry, guys, for the delay. Thank you for allowing my blood sugar to come right. Much appreciated. Cheers, guys. Sorry.
Trust me, we know it's the best thing to do.